President Biden is gearing up for a high-stakes phone call with Vladimir Putin later today as tensions escalate between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine. The White House says Moscow requested the call. We know this will be the second time this month the two leaders have spoken. It comes as Russia says it's withdrawn about 10,000 troops from the Ukrainian border. However, that's just a fraction of the estimated 100,000 forces the country has mobilized across the region, sparking global fears of a possible invasion. For more on this, CBS News correspondent Imtiaz Tyab joins me from London. Imtiaz, what can we expect from today's call between President Biden and President Putin? Do we know why Putin requested the call?
Hey, good to talk to you. Well, officially, we've been told the two leaders will speak by phone later tonight, where they'll discuss, security talks in January that are planned between the two countries, as well as the broader situation in Europe. But what many people are hoping is that this call is going to be the beginning of a pathway to real diplomacy that can lead to a genuine de-escalation to a situation that's being described as, quote, the most dangerous it's been in 30 years. Now, analysts say President Putin is likely to push for swift acceptance of his proposed security deal that would essentially forbid the Ukraine from ever joining NATO and would also prevent any other expansion by the alliance in nations that were formerly part of the USSR. Now, these demands have long been ruled out by NATO, who says nations, including the Ukraine, are sovereign and should make their own decisions. And Russia, again, wants the opposite, including to be able to veto the security decisions of Ukraine and other nations. This is something that many are expecting him to push President Biden on. So a lot of attention will be paid to that call and, more importantly, how it will affect these talks that are expected on the 10th of January.
We mentioned that Russia says it's withdrawn about 10,000 troops from the Ukrainian border. What is the situation on the ground there right now?
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, and we should start by saying that President Biden has already warned Mr. Putin that he would impose tough new sanctions on Russia if it escalates action against the Ukraine. We also understand that the president would respond to any kind of military aggression by providing NATO with reinforcements and offering the Ukraine military assistance in its efforts to defend itself against any kind of Russian military aggression. But as we've been saying, the situation on the ground in the Ukraine is very tense, and certainly in the surrounding areas where those Russian troops are surging. But many people are asking is if this military, or if the Russian military does move in, will we see U.S. troops on the ground in support of the Ukraine? Now that, most agree, is pretty unlikely. We have to remember that President Biden is the president who ended America's longest war in Afghanistan by vowing to end, quote, forever wars. So it seems pretty unlikely that he'd be dragged into a boots-on-the-ground battle with Russia over the Ukraine. But even in an assistance capacity, this would be a significant entanglement for the U.S. with, it has to be said, a very formidable foe. So this is a very tense situation, which is why it's attracting so much attention. And indeed, this conversation that will be held later tonight between both presidents of the U.S. and Russia is seen as very crucial in hoping to sort of dial down the situation there.
As you mentioned, the talks that are planned for January 10th in Geneva between U.S. and Russian officials, those are going to be in person. So how do you think today's call might impact that meeting? And importantly, why won't President Biden or President Putin be present at that discussion?
Well, when that meeting was first announced, we knew that these two leaders weren't going to be there. It's usually, accepted that lower-level members of cabinet or government will be there. But this call could signal a change that both Presidents Biden and Putin do want to meet face-to-face at some point. In fact, Mr. Putin has gone on the record saying that he believes in face-to-face diplomacy. And if this is a meaningful move towards a diplomatic resolution, I think people would really welcome that. Now, whether these two leaders meet or not, these are going to be very important talks in Geneva, and the hope is that, as we've been saying, a diplomatic solution can be found. But when it comes to that diplomacy, Mr. Putin has made it clear he would not wait long for those security guarantees that he's demanding, saying he was not interested in protracted negotiations, only, quote, results. Now, to add a bit of background to this, Mr. Putin has been open in his anger over NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe, as he sees it, after the fall of the USSR 3 decades ago, and continues to assert that part of the Ukraine's current territory historically belongs to Russia, which is why he says it kind of bolsters his argument that Ukrainian membership in NATO would be a red line and something that he, as the leader of Russia, simply will not accept.
Well, speaking of NATO, how are other allies reacting? And are leaders concerned about that if this conflict between Russia and Ukraine escalates, that it could bring it closer and closer to Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a huge amount of concern across Europe, and that's why we're seeing this kind of move, if you will, of these leaders across Europe sort of standing in line with the Ukraine and indeed with the U.S. as well, because we have to be clear, very few people want to see a Russian war in the Ukraine. But as we've been saying, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg continues to insist that the Ukraine's membership of the alliance is a matter for NATO and the Ukraine, not Russia. But again, as we've been saying, we're seeing a growing and quite strong coalition of European leaders who, along with the U.S., coming together under this common cause of protecting the Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And while the Ukraine is still not a NATO member, it has close ties with the bloc as well as the rest of Europe. And that perhaps explains why Russia is demanding what it's saying is, quote, a legally binding guarantee that NATO will not move eastwards into the Ukraine and that weapons will not be sent to the Ukrainian government or any other neighboring countries. Again, something that the Kremlin says is a red line for them.
Imtiaz Tyab, thank you for the context ahead of this call between Russia's President Putin and President Biden. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.